The Supreme Court's decision to hear the case concerning whether a federal law prohibiting the sale of firearms to unlawful users of, or those addicted to controlled substances, violates the Second Amendment will be a landmark ruling with significant consequences. The case, likely to focus on individuals who use marijuana, even in states where it is legal, stems from the 1968 Gun Control Act and directly challenges the federal government's authority to disarm a broad category of citizens. Summary of the issue. The core of the dispute lies in 18 U.S.C. 922G3, which makes it a felony for any person who is an unlawful user of or addicted to any controlled substance to possess a firearm. Because marijuana remains illegal under federal law, even state legal consumers are technically considered unlawful users. The Supreme Court's 2022 ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, Inc. Broom, established a new test for Second Amendment challenges. The government must justify any firearm regulation by demonstrating that it is consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Since Broom, several lower courts have struck down the drug user ban, arguing that the government has failed to provide sufficient historical evidence from the founding era to justify disarming a nonviolent, sober person simply for drug use. The case the Supreme Court agreed to hear, United States v. Hamani, involves a defendant whose gun charge for being an unlawful drug user was dismissed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on Second Amendment grounds. The Justice Department is appealing that dismissal, seeking to have the law upheld based on analogies to historical restrictions on common drunkards who were deemed a societal risk. Analysis and reasons for the legal challenge. The primary reason for the legal challenge is the clash between modern drug policy and the Broom historical test. The Second Amendment argument. Challengers. Proponents for striking down the ban argue that historical regulations only permitted disarming individuals who posed a demonstrable danger to society, typically through criminal acts, or those who were actively intoxicated. They contend that a non-violent, law-abiding individual, aside from the drug use itself, should not lose their fundamental constitutional right based solely on habitual or past drug use, especially cannabis use, now legal in many states. They assert that the government cannot provide a historical analog from the 18th or 19th centuries that supports disarming someone merely for using an intoxicating substance outside of a criminal context. The government's argument. Defenders. The Justice Department argues that the law is a constitutional and modest modern restriction necessary for public safety. They claim that the restriction is temporary. A person can regain their gun rights simply by ceasing unlawful drug use, and that a history of disarming habitual drunkards is a sufficient historical analogy. They stress that drug users, particularly those with addiction, pose a unique and heightened risk of armed confrontation with law enforcement and generally demonstrate poor judgment regarding public safety. Furthermore, they emphasize that the law targets only habitual or chronic users, not those with single isolated incidents. The decision is essentially a test of the limits of the Broom historical test. It forces the court to determine how closely a modern regulation must match its historical predecessor, and whether the government can disarm a person without a finding of dangerousness tied to criminal conduct or mental illness, predicted consequences, and potential solutions. The Supreme Court's ruling will have profound consequences for both gun rights and drug policy across the nation. Consequences. If the ban is struck down, millions of cannabis users, including medical marijuana patients, who are currently prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms under federal law, would likely be granted their Second Amendment rights. This would create significant legal friction, as federal prohibitions on gun sales would clash directly with state legal cannabis markets. It would also lead to immediate challenges against other prohibited person categories not directly tied to violent crime or mental health. If the ban is upheld, the ruling would affirm the government's ability to impose restrictions on gun rights for categories of individuals deemed a risk, even if not based on a crime of violence. It would solidify a major exception to the Broom standard, but could also prompt the court to narrowly redefine unlawful user to perhaps exclude occasional users and focus only on chronic addiction. Solutions mitigation. Regardless of the outcome, legislative or regulatory clarity will be needed. 1. Federal legislative reform. Congress could amend the Gun Control Act to specifically exclude individuals using substances legal under state law, like cannabis, from the unlawful user definition. This would resolve the conflict for state legal marijuana consumers without affecting restrictions on users of Schedule I substances like cocaine or heroin. 2. Regulatory redefinition. If the court rules in a limited manner, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, might issue new guidance to more precisely define unlawful user to align with a strict reading of the Second Amendment, perhaps only applying the ban to those actively intoxicated or determined to be a danger on a case-by-case basis. The final decision will redefine the boundary of Second Amendment protections, establishing whether an individual's status as a drug user is a sufficient basis for disarming them under a historical standard of regulation.